want to tell you one more story that's actually about, I told you I didn't care if you guys pee on whatever, but if I had a job, I might care. And if I had a job like running a hospital, I might care a lot about whether you wash your hands after you use a restroom or after you interact with a patient or whatnot. So it turns out that hand hygiene in hospitals is really important, right? We all know this. We know that infections, that more people die of hospital-acquired infections every year than die from most of the things that most of us worry about getting killed from. Like, raise your hand if you have never worried about being murdered by a stranger. Never. Raise your hand if you've never. It's like 1, 2, 3. Right, very, very few people. Most of us worry about this at some point, even though the data suggests that being killed by a stranger is unbelievably rare. So you're much more like, okay, so this is, I'll get somber for a moment. You're much more likely to kill someone, to kill yourself than to kill someone else, which is the real sadness. The suicide rates in this country are relatively very high and have been getting higher. You're much more likely to be killed in a car accident than to be killed by someone else. But of all those things, acquiring an infection in a hospital and having it kill you is probably the most common way to go. So that's not good, right? And of all the ways to cut down on that, again, the easiest, simplest, cheapest way is really good hand hygiene. It won't always cure the problem, but it'll help a lot. So hospitals for years have been preaching this to their doctors. So how well do doctors do? Well, all right, let's look at the data. How do you get the data? Well, all right, there's a nice study in Australia not that long ago where they, a bunch of academic researchers came into a hospital, the children's hospital, and they asked a set of doctors to report back to the researchers at the end of every day their hand hygiene rate. So basically, you're supposed to wash your hands before and after every significant patient contact. And the self-reported rate over the course of this study, which was, I think, a little less than 3 months, they reported every day, the self-reported rate was 73%. So that's just one piece of data. What does it tell you? It's hard to say. It could mean that the doctors are know better than you all, who are probably about 70%, but at least they're honest, right? It could say that. We don't know. It's just a number in isolation. So that's their declared preference or their self-reported survey data. But the researchers, being clever, also set up a different part of the experiment where they had nurses. They basically deputized the nurses to spy on the doctors, okay? And this is good for a number of reasons, including the fact that nurses are way more empathetic than doctors. I hate to say it. The data show that as well. So the nurses would basically, every time a doc would walk into a patient's room, the nurse would either follow or look or listen and note whether the doc washed his or her hands or hit the disinfectant pump. And they wrote down that data. And then they could compare that data to the self-reported data for the very same doctors during the very same period. So really nice, clean data. The doctors who had reported 73%, very same doctors over the same period, the actual observed rate of hand hygiene was 9%, okay? So forget about how bad that is, which is very bad. Just think about the fact that if you're trying to solve a problem, whatever the problem is, if 3 out of 4 people tell you they're doing something, well, wait, that's not quite right. It's not 3 out of 4 people say. If people say they're doing something 3 out of 4 times, but they're actually only doing it 1 out of 10, well, not only is the problem bigger than you thought, but the nature of the problem may be entirely different too. It's not just magnitude. And that's really important to know if you're trying to solve, if you're in charge of solving the problem. So how do you solve a problem like that? I mean, it's weird, right? Because in our culture, one thing that we preach about education and why everybody should get as much education as they can or can afford or as much as they want is that education is, it's the tide that lifts all boats. The smarter you are, the better it is for me. It's a public good, right? There's all kinds of positive externalities associated with it. And so we want people to be smart. And one of the big reasons we say we want people to be smart is the smarter that people are, the less likely they are to engage in risky behavior that, while it may affect them adversely, can also really affect everyone else adversely. Drunk driving, classic example. Drunk driving is wildly risky to do, and yet almost as many of the victims of drunk drivers are totally, totally innocent. So that's a classic case of a negative externality, the idea being that the positive externality is what we want. If everybody can get educated, they'll do less risky behavior and so on. But it turns out that education doesn't necessarily correlate very well with being less risky. Or at least for the population of people who want to do a lot of risky stuff, you can educate them and preach to them a lot, and that turns out to be an incredibly inefficient channel. So the reason I'm saying this is because doctors are the most educated people in the hospital, and they also have the lowest rate of hand hygiene of anyone. So the correlation is not there. Here's another, but also, whenever you think that you can teach someone away from the behavior that you don't want them to do, you should really rethink that, because the data do not support that. So for instance, you guys remember the Partnership for a Drug-Free America ad campaigns? I see some. So like, I think they would take an egg, this is your brain, like an egg, that beautiful clean food, and then crack the egg into a sizzling frying pan, and this is your brain on drugs. That's what the ad said, right? And they spent billions of dollars, and later, many years later, some researchers measured the effect of the Partnership for a Drug-Free America ad campaign. It turns out that it increased drug use. How could that possibly be, right? You're telling people that this is bad for their brains, right? You're educating them about the risk. So here's the thing. When you look at data the way I do, the data will tell you the why, the what. It'll tell you this number moved when this thing happened. But it doesn't always tell you the why. In fact, it almost never tells you the why. The why is can be really hard. So why did the Partnership for Drug-Free messages fail? One reason may be that if you're like a 17-year-old kid and you haven't gotten high yet that day, and you're kind of on the fence, and you're sitting there watching TV, and this ad comes on, and all of a sudden you see a fried egg, you think, I'm hungry, I'm gonna get stoned and eat. Like, that may be the mechanism that actually produced the behavior, as opposed to like, oh my gosh. So like, behavior, especially in the case of the doctors in the hospitals, was not influenced so much by education. So how do you solve a problem where people are doing something that's not what you want them to do, where they know it's not the right thing to do? How do you figure out, how do you find data to create a better incentive? So I'll tell you what's ultimately a success story. There's a hospital in LA called Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Amazing, world-class hospital on just about every dimension. They do all the hard stuff really well, but their hand hygiene rate among doctors was about 60%, so not very good. They found this out by having their nurses spy on the doctors, okay? That's how they got their internal data. And they said, you know, look, we're an amazing hospital. We should have 100% hand hygiene rate. There's just no excuse for it. So they did what we like to do in America, particularly corporate America, when we have a problem that's really serious and we want to signal just how serious we take it. They formed a committee, and this committee was called the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center Chief of Staff Hand Hygiene Advisory Committee. It's like Chichasahing for short, okay? And this was made up of like 30 of the top officials at the hospital, most of whom were medical doctors themselves. So they know the science, they know how all this works. And they get together and they say, okay, we've signaled that it's an important problem, what do we do? And they sat down the committee and they said, well, you know, it's not an education problem, we think it's a communication problem. We need to communicate better to our doctors, so they had this amazing idea. They said, let's write a memo and send it to everybody, because we all know that everyone reads memos and does exactly what they tell. So they write this memo, they distribute it to everybody, they're having their nurses measure the hand hygiene every day, and the needle doesn't move at all. I mean, why would it, right? No one really does what memos tell them to do. So then they thought, all right, we need to take our message to the wards, to the rooms where the doctors are actually seeing their patients. This is where the failure happens. So they came up with this amazing idea where they were gonna break the big committee of 30 into smaller groups of 2 or 3, and this was now going to be called the Posse Patrol Program Subcommittee of the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center Chief of Staff Hand Hygiene Advisory Committee. So this is like Chichasahing Triple P Subcommittee, okay? And the way the Posse Patrol Program would work is 2 or 3 of the doctors on the committee would wait until it was time for the docs to make their rounds to go see patients, and they would go into patients' room and hide and wait. And their original plan was that when they would see a doc come in and not wash his or her hands, their original plan was that they would like jump out and scowl at them and take their names and publicly post them. So their first idea was public shame. A negative incentive, right? And then they thought, well, you know what? They might not like that so much. So whenever you're trying to come up with an incentive to get people to respond, you know, there are many flavors. There's financial, but there's social and moral. Our reputations, you know, people protect their reputation. That's a strong incentive. But there's also positive and negative, right? There's carrot and stick. And originally they wanted to go with the stick because stick is fun. Stick is always fun. That's why we punish so much. It's fun to do that. If you have kids, you know. The reason we don't bribe our kids as much as we should is because it's really fun to say, I can't believe you did that. You are whatever, grounded, or you have to like wear your mother's clothes for a week. That's what we do. That only works with my son. My daughter likes it. But we punish a lot because, I don't know why. Maybe it's an American thing, but we like to punish. But that's what Cedars-Sinai thought. Then they thought, you know, the doctors would get really upset. Why don't we try something else? Let's try a positive incentive. So they did. They switched it. And here's what they actually did. The Posse Patrol program, same thing. When the docs were coming around on their rounds, they'd go in like the patient's room and they'd crouch behind like a wall or a curtain, or like if there's a piece of equipment, they'd hide behind it. And then when the doc would come in and when they would hear the doc successfully wash his or her hands, they would jump out and clap for the doctor. And then they'd give them a $10 Starbucks card as a reward for washing their hands. And when the chief of staff of the hospital told me this when I was interviewing him, I said to him, you know, this guy is a brilliant surgeon. He ran the ER, brilliant, brilliant man. I said, no offense, you are so much smarter than I'm ever going to be, but that idea just sounds so stupid that you are trying to change the behavior of the highest earners in your hospital. These doctors are earning like between $400,000 and $600,000 a year. You're trying to change the behavior of these big earners with $10 worth of free coffee? That is just so dumb. And I learned a really good lesson that day, so I was wrong. And the lesson I learned, which I'm guessing many of you already know, is never underestimate the power of free on anyone, okay? Because it really doesn't matter if someone's wealthy, if they have plenty, or even if like, you can walk up to people like who are holding a bushel of apples in their arms, and if you offer them a free apple, they'll put down like the bushel to take the free, like, so I'm about to insult the conference here. I'm guessing this being a conference, you're giving away some free stuff, because that's what you do. So here's the insult. That wasn't the insult part. The insult is that stuff that they're giving you may be or could be total crap, but you're still gonna line up for it, and you're still gonna get it, and you're gonna take it home, and you're gonna love it, only because it's free. It could be like sweatbands for your pet, and you're still gonna want them just because it's free. And that's the way the doctors at Cedars-Sinai were. They loved getting the free cards, so much so that not a single doctor ever turned down a card and ever said, you know what? You're paying me $500,000. Why don't you take the $10 and use it for like Band-Aids or something? Nobody ever said that. Furthermore, they began to game the system. And when they would hear that the posse was on their floor, they'd run up and start washing their hands everywhere to try to get extra cards, okay? So that's great. That's great. They took literally like a life and death problem and turned it into a game that people wanted to play, which is great. The only issue was it didn't work. It worked in that they wanted the cards, but it didn't increase hand hygiene. Why? Again, the why is hard. It may be that if I'm a doctor and I run into the posse when I'm seeing my patient in room 504, and then I've got another patient in room 512, I know the posse's not there because I already got my card, and I'm a little behind from chatting with the posse, and maybe even just subconsciously I skipped the hand washing, but for whatever reason, it didn't move the needle. So now the poor committee is stuck. And someone at this one meeting spoke up, and this was, I think, the first time that she'd ever spoken up at this big meeting. And even though this is not the point of my story, I just want to dwell on it for 1 minute because I think it's really important. This was the staff epidemiologist at the hospital. She's a scientist. She's very quiet. She did her job great, but she wasn't a loudmouth. And so she'd never really spoken up at the meeting before. And when I heard this story and when I realized the result of it, which I'm going to tell you in a minute, I realized that, you know, it's very natural, especially in certain kinds of industries, when you have meetings, you know, our meeting culture is such that the noisy people often get the floor and keep the floor, and their ideas get treated much better than an idea that might be better, but it's spoken by a quiet person, or maybe not spoken at all. And that's really the big danger, is when the noisy people, people like me, hog all the oxygen. The quieter people who may have much better ideas don't even get to have their ideas out. So that's why I would encourage you, and whatever kind of firm you're at, however you run your meetings, I would try to make them as blind as possible. For one, men particularly discount female ideas from women, but women discount ideas from women even more than men, interestingly. But also, we just know from the social science so much about the way that we judge people based on our kind of gut feeling about, like, they are powerful, they are smart, they are successful, that it's really hard to divorce that from the quality of the idea itself. And so whatever you can do to recreate the idea of, like, you know, a blind audition for an orchestra where the musician is playing behind a curtain where I can't see who that person is. You're going for sound because that's what you care about. The more we can do that in getting ideas, I think the better off we'll all be. So this person, the staff epidemiologist, she said, you know, I have a thought. It's not really a problem, a solution to this problem of hand hygiene, but it might be a way for us to think about it a little bit differently. And she pulled out a bag with 20 Petri dishes with agar plates, the thing used in high school bio to take a culture. And she said, you know, here we are, the bosses of the whole hospital, telling everybody else how they're failing. What about us? Are our hands clean? Are we free of the bacteria we're telling everybody else that they're carrying around? And she had everybody lay their palms in the Petri dishes, and she wrapped them up, and she sent them to the lab. She anonymized them. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone, and she had them cultured. And it turned out that the vast majority of their hands were covered with the very bacteria they'd been telling everybody else that they were failing to get rid of. And this was an incredibly sobering moment for them, an incredibly good use of a small set of data, really, to understand the problem better. And they realized that not only were they not fixing the problem, but they were as bad as anybody else. And then they thought, well, is there any way that we can use this, if you want to call it data, or use this idea to create an incentive that really might change behavior? And that's when the chief of staff of the hospital came up with an idea that turned out to be truly a great idea, the winning idea. He said, what if we take a photograph of one of these Petri dishes, which if you're a doctor is just a scary sight. It's a handprint shape of nasty bacteria. And said, what if we just take a photograph of one of them, make it known that it belongs to one of us, and make it the screensaver on every computer in the hospital. And they did it, and like literally virtually overnight, hand hygiene compliance among docs at Cedars-Sinai shot up to 100%. No one would have predicted that. No one would have ever even come up with that if they hadn't been so desperate. It worked so well that other hospitals around the country began to call and write to Cedars-Sinai to say, hey, can you send us that picture of the bacteria? Like, because we don't have bacteria in our hospital that we could take pictures of, right? So I think I should stop talking now because you need to have cocktails. But if you want to ask me a couple questions before, are you giving them drinks or am I making that up? I was just associating like whatever time it is with cocktail hour. So anyway, oh, you have okay. So if you want to ask me a question, I have nowhere to go. I live here. Whatever happens to me at home is worse than this. So feel free to ask some questions. Oh, thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.